Sir, that service dog is not properly registered in our municipal database. We have reports of aggressive behavior, and frankly, these emotional support claims are getting out of hand. The animal needs to be removed immediately. The city animal control officer, a stern woman named Patricia Walsh with clipboard authority and zero compassion, stood blocking the entrance to the downtown Phoenix Community Center where Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez had just finished his weekly veterans therapy group session. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake, 34 years old with invisible scars that ran deeper than the shrapnel wounds across his left shoulder, instinctively placed his hand on the head of Bruno, his German Shepherd service dog. Bruno wasn't just a companion, he was Jake's lifeline, trained to detect the onset of panic attacks, interrupt nightmares, and provide deep pressure therapy during episodes of post-traumatic stress that could leave Jake paralyzed with fear for hours. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that this confrontation was happening just steps away from the very building where he'd been sharing his struggles with fellow veterans, talking about the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life, the bureaucratic nightmares of dealing with government agencies, and the constant battle to be understood and respected for sacrifices made in service to his country. Now standing in the Arizona heat, he was living that nightmare in real time. Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, with the Army Rangers, leading dangerous reconnaissance missions in the most hostile territories. He'd been the guy other soldiers looked to when everything went sideways, the steady presence who could make life or death decisions under intense enemy fire. His service record was exemplary: multiple commendations for valor, a Purple Heart, and the deep respect of every man and woman who'd served alongside him. But the war had extracted its price, leaving him with severe PTSD that made ordinary civilian situations feel like combat zones. After his medical retirement, Jake had moved to Phoenix, drawn by the warm climate and the promise of a fresh start. He'd used his GI Bill benefits to pursue a degree in counseling, driven by a desire to help other veterans navigate the difficult transition from military to civilian life. His small apartment near the university was modest but comfortable, decorated with a few meaningful mementos from his service, a folded flag, a photo of his unit, and Bruno's training certificates prominently displayed on the wall. Bruno had come into Jake's life through a specialized program that paired service dogs with combat veterans struggling with PTSD. The 18-month training process had been intensive, not just for Bruno, but for Jake as well. Learning to trust. Again, to rely on another living being, to accept help. These were skills that didn't come naturally to someone trained to be self-sufficient in the most dangerous environments on Earth. The bond between Jake and Bruno was extraordinary. Bruno could sense the subtle changes in Jake's breathing that preceded a panic attack, the slight tremor in his hands that indicated rising anxiety, the restless movements that suggested nightmares were approaching. When Jake would wake up screaming from dreams where he was back in the Hindu Kush Mountains, watching his friends die, Bruno would immediately provide grounding pressure, lying across Jake's chest until his heart rate returned to normal and reality reasserted itself. Jake's daily routine revolved around stability and predictability, things his therapist had emphasized were crucial for managing PTSD. Morning runs with Bruno through the desert trails surrounding Phoenix, afternoon classes at the university, and evening volunteer work at the Veteran Center. It was a carefully constructed life designed to provide purpose and healing, a delicate balance that took months to establish and could be shattered in moments. The weekly therapy group at the community center had become a cornerstone of Jake's recovery. Led by Dr. Sarah Chun, a psychiatrist who specialized in veteran mental health, The group provided a safe space for warriors to process their experiences with others who understood the weight of combat memories. Jake had been attending for 8 months, slowly opening up about his struggles, finding strength in shared stories of survival and resilience. Today's session had been particularly meaningful. Jake had shared a breakthrough moment from the previous week when he'd successfully managed a panic attack triggered by fireworks at a neighbor's celebration without needing emergency medication. Bruno had detected the onset symptoms and provided intervention, allowing Jake to use the coping strategies he'd learned in therapy. It was a victory worth celebrating, a sign that the healing process was working. The community center itself was a converted warehouse in downtown Phoenix, repurposed to serve veterans and their families. The walls were lined with memorial photos and inspirational quotes, creating an atmosphere of honor and remembrance. Local businesses had donated furniture and equipment, and volunteers maintained a small library of resources for veterans dealing with everything from job placement to housing assistance. Patricia Walsh, the animal control officer now standing between Jake and his vehicle, represented everything wrong with bureaucratic power wielded without wisdom or compassion. In her mid-40s with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, she carried herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never faced real danger, but delighted in exercising authority over others. Her uniform was immaculate. Her clipboard held like a weapon, and her expression suggested she found genuine satisfaction in disrupting people's lives. The complaint that had brought Patricia to the community center was as petty as it was false. An anonymous caller had reported an aggressive dog at the veterans meeting, claiming the animal had threatened people in the parking lot. In reality, Bruno had done nothing more than what he was trained to do: stay close to Jake, remain alert to his handler's emotional state, and provide the calming presence that allowed Jake to function in public spaces. Jake's service dog credentials were impeccable. Bruno was registered with the appropriate state and federal agencies, had undergone extensive behavioral testing, and possessed documentation that clearly identified him as a legitimate service animal protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The leather folder containing Bruno's papers was comprehensive veterinary records, training certifications, behavioral assessments, and official registration documents that should have ended any legitimate inquiry within minutes. But Patricia Walsh wasn't interested in legitimate inquiry. She was interested in flexing bureaucratic muscle, demonstrating her authority, and making an example out of someone she perceived as trying to game the system. Her skeptical examination of Bruno's documentation was perfunctory at best, dismissive at worst. She flipped through the papers with theatrical disdain, muttering about forgeries and fraud as if Jake were some street con artist rather than a decorated combat veteran. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The gathering crowd of onlookers added another layer of humiliation to the encounter. Fellow veterans from Jake's therapy group lingered nearby, uncertain whether to intervene or give their friends space to handle the situation. Dr. Chun stood in the community center doorway, her professional composure barely containing obvious anger at the scene unfolding in her facility's parking lot. Passing pedestrians slowed their pace, drawn by the confrontation like observers at a traffic accident. Bruno, meanwhile, remained perfectly behaved throughout the ordeal. The German shepherd sat calmly at Jake's side, occasionally glancing up at his handler's face to monitor stress levels, but showing none of the aggressive behavior that had supposedly prompted the investigation. His training was evident in every subtle movement, the way he positioned himself to provide maximum comfort to Jake, the alert but non-threatening posture he maintained, the gentle pressure he applied against Jake's leg when anxiety levels began to rise. Patricia's dismissal of the documentation was swift and brutal. "These papers don't look official to me," she announced loudly enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "The registration numbers don't match our database, and frankly, this whole emotional support dog trend has gotten completely out of hand. Real service dogs go through years of training with certified programs, not these online certificate mills." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow. Everything Patricia was saying was demonstrably false. Bruno's training had been extensive and legitimate, conducted by one of the most respected service dog organizations in the country. The documentation she was dismissing had been accepted without question by airlines, hotels, restaurants, and every other business Jake had encountered over the past 2 years. But facts seemed irrelevant in the face of Patricia's predetermined conclusions. Jake's military training kicked in as he fought to maintain composure. Years of dealing with hostile situations had taught him the importance of staying calm under pressure, of not escalating conflicts unnecessarily, of finding diplomatic solutions to confrontational encounters. But this wasn't enemy territory. This was supposed to be home, the country he'd sworn to defend, the society he'd sacrificed so much to protect. "Ma'am," Jake began, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest, "I understand you have concerns, but Bruno is a legitimate service dog. His documentation is complete and current. He's never shown aggressive behavior toward anyone, and he's protected under federal law." Patricia's response was as predictable as it was infuriating. "Sir, I don't care what you think federal law says. This is a municipal matter, and I have authority to remove any animal that poses a public safety risk. Your dog is coming with me until this matter can be properly investigated." The threat to separate Jake from Bruno represented more than simple inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe for someone whose mental health depended on the constant presence of his service animal. Without Bruno's interventions, Jake's PTSD symptoms could spiral out of control within hours. The panic attacks would return with devastating intensity, the nightmares would become unbearable, and the carefully constructed stability of his civilian life would crumble. Dr. Chun finally stepped forward from the community center entrance, her professional credentials and calm authority cutting through the chaos of the parking lot confrontation. "Officer Walsh, I'm Dr. Sarah Chun, a licensed psychiatrist specializing in veteran mental health. I can personally attest to both Mr. Rodriguez's need for his service animal and Bruno's exemplary behavior. This intervention is not only unnecessary but potentially harmful to my patient's well-being." Patricia's dismissal of Dr. Chun's professional opinion was as swift as her rejection of Bruno's documentation. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but animal control matters fall under municipal authority, not medical opinion. If this veteran needs psychiatric care, there are proper channels and facilities for that. What he doesn't need is an unregistered animal masquerading as medical equipment." The casual dismissal of both Jake's service and his genuine medical needs, the reduction of Bruno from life-saving service animal to unregistered pet, and the bureaucratic arrogance that placed paperwork above human welfare pushed Jake past his breaking point. But instead of exploding in anger, instead of letting his combat training take over, Jake did something that would change everything. He reached into his pocket for his phone, scrolling through a contact list that most people would assume belonged to someone much more important than a struggling veteran trying to rebuild his life in Phoenix, Arizona. Jake's fingers moved with practiced precision across his phone screen, navigating to a contact that few people would believe existed in the device of someone Patricia Walsh had already dismissed as a fraud. The name that appeared, Governor Maria Elena Vasquez, represented more than just political power. It represented a connection forged in the crucible of shared military service, mutual respect, and an unbreakable bond between warriors who had faced death together in the mountains of Afghanistan. Maria Vasquez hadn't always been Arizona's governor. 12 years earlier, she had been Captain Vasquez, leading a special operations unit tasked with gathering intelligence in some of the most dangerous regions of the war zone. Jake Rodriguez had been her senior non-commissioned officer, the experienced sergeant who translated her battlefield decisions into actionable orders that kept their team alive through mission after mission. Together, they had navigated ambushes, survived mortar attacks, and pulled wounded comrades from burning vehicles under enemy fire. The bond between an officer and their senior NCO in combat is unlike any other relationship in human experience. It's built on absolute trust, mutual dependence, and shared responsibility for the lives of everyone under their command. Maria had relied on Jake's tactical expertise and leadership experience, while Jake had trusted Maria's strategic thinking and unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home alive. They had been a team in the truest sense, each making the other stronger, each covering the other's weaknesses. When Maria had decided to pursue a career in politics after her military service, driven by a desire to advocate for veterans and military families, Jake had been one of her earliest supporters. He had volunteered for her first campaign for state legislature, stuffing envelopes and making phone calls from his apartment while struggling with his own transition to civilian life. Even as his PTSD symptoms worsened and his ability to function in crowded spaces diminished, Jake had found ways to support Maria's political rise because he believed in her vision of public service. Maria's journey from combat officer to state governor had been remarkable but not easy. She had faced skepticism about her age, her military background, and her gender from political establishments that preferred candidates who looked and sounded like the politicians they were used to seeing. But Maria had brought the same determination to politics that she had brought to combat operations, building coalitions, finding common ground, and never backing down from fights that mattered. Her gubernatorial campaign had focused heavily on veterans issues, mental health reform, and government accountability. She had promised to cut through bureaucratic red tape that prevented veterans from accessing services they had earned through their sacrifice. She had pledged to hold government employees accountable for their treatment of the people they were supposed to serve. Most importantly, she had vowed to remember that public service meant serving the public, especially those who had already served their country. Jake had been present at Maria's inauguration, standing in the crowd of supporters as she took the oath of office and officially became the most powerful person in Arizona state government. It had been one of the few public events he had attended since his medical retirement, and only Bruno's presence had made it possible for him to endure the crowds, the noise, and the emotional intensity of watching his former commanding officer reach the pinnacle of civilian leadership. Now, as Patricia Walsh continued her bureaucratic power play in the community center parking lot, Jake was about to call in a favor that would demonstrate the true meaning of loyalty between veterans. The phone rang twice before Maria's familiar voice answered, instantly recognizable despite the years that had passed and the political pressures that had undoubtedly changed many aspects of her life. "Jake Rodriguez," Maria said immediately, her voice warm with genuine affection. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" "I've been better, Governor," Jake replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos unfolding around him. "I'm currently standing in a parking lot in downtown Phoenix while an animal control officer is trying to confiscate Bruno based on what she claims are fraudulent service dog credentials. She's dismissed his legitimate documentation, ignored a psychiatrist's professional testimony, and seems determined to separate me from my service animal regardless of the consequences." The silence on the other end of the line lasted only seconds, but Jake could practically hear the gears turning in Maria's mind as she processed the situation. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same steely determination that had gotten their unit through impossible missions in Afghanistan. "Jake, I need you to put me on speakerphone right now. I want to hear exactly what's happening, and I want everyone present to hear my response." Jake complied, holding his phone up so that Maria's voice would carry clearly across the parking lot. Patricia Walsh, who had been preparing to physically remove Bruno from Jake's side, suddenly found herself facing something she hadn't anticipated: direct intervention from the highest elected official in the state of Arizona. "This is Governor Maria Vasquez," the voice from Jake's phone announced with unmistakable authority. "To whom am I speaking?" Patricia stammered for a moment before finding her voice. "This is Patricia Walsh, Animal Control Officer for the City of Phoenix. I'm conducting a routine investigation into reports of an unregistered service animal." "Officer Walsh," Maria continued, her tone taking on the commanding quality that had once directed military operations, "I need you to understand something very clearly. The man you are harassing is Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez, a decorated combat veteran who served with distinction in Afghanistan. The service dog you are threatening to confiscate is Bruno, a legitimate service animal whose training and credentials are beyond reproach. What you are doing right now is not just legally questionable, it's morally reprehensible." The crowd in the parking lot had grown larger as Maria's voice carried across the space. Veterans from Jake's therapy group moved closer, their expressions shifting from concern to amazement, as they realized they were witnessing their friend receive direct support from the governor herself. Dr. Chun stood with her arms crossed, her professional satisfaction evident as she watched bureaucratic arrogance meet political reality. Patricia, however, wasn't ready to back down. Years of exercising unchecked authority over people she perceived as powerless had created a mindset that couldn't easily accept being challenged, even by the governor. "Governor Vasquez, I appreciate your concern, but this is a municipal matter. Animal control falls under city jurisdiction, and I have both the authority and the responsibility to investigate reports of fraudulent service animals." Maria's response demonstrated why she had been successful, both as a military officer and as a politician. Instead of simply asserting her authority, she began systematically dismantling Patricia's position with facts, law, and logic. "Officer Walsh, let me educate you about both the law and the situation you're attempting to create. First, the Americans with Disabilities Act is federal law that supersedes any municipal ordinance. Second, legitimate service animals are protected under that federal law regardless of local registration requirements. Third, Master Sergeant Rodriguez's service dog credentials are maintained in federal databases that your municipal system may not access, but that I can verify within minutes." As Maria spoke, she was clearly multitasking, her voice occasionally distant as she issued orders to staff members who had suddenly found themselves researching Arizona's service animal laws and federal 8A compliance requirements. The efficiency with which she mobilized resources demonstrated the kind of executive capability that had made her successful in both military and political leadership roles. "But more importantly," Maria continued, her voice rising with controlled anger, "what you're doing to a combat veteran who sacrificed his health in service to this country is unconscionable. Master Sergeant Rodriguez didn't just serve in Afghanistan, he served with me. He kept me and our entire unit alive through 3 combat deployments. He earned a Purple Heart, multiple commendations for valor, and the lifelong gratitude of everyone who served alongside him." The personal nature of Maria's testimony was having a visible effect on the crowd. Veterans in the parking lot straightened their postures, recognizing the rare moment when one of their own was being publicly honored by someone who understood the true cost of their service. Civilian onlookers began to grasp the magnitude of Patricia's misjudgment, realizing they were witnessing a decorated war hero being harassed by a petty bureaucrat. Patricia's face was flushing red as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. The anonymous complaint that had seemed like routine business an hour earlier was now attracting the attention of the governor's office, and her confident assertions about fraudulent documentation were being challenged by someone with both the authority and the resources to verify every claim she had made. "Furthermore," Maria continued, her voice taking on the tone she had once used to address military personnel who had failed to meet standards, I want you to understand that your actions today will have consequences far beyond this parking lot. I'm directing my staff to conduct a comprehensive review of Phoenix Animal Control's policies and procedures regarding service animals. I'm ordering an investigation into how many veterans have been harassed by your department. And I'm personally ensuring that every city employee who interacts with veterans receives proper training on federal disability law. Jake watched Patricia's expression change as the full implications of her situation became clear. What had started as a routine power play against someone she assumed was powerless was now threatening to become a career-ending scandal that would attract statewide attention to her department's practices. Dr. Chun chose that moment to step forward, her professional credentials adding weight to the governor's political authority. Governor Vasquez, as the supervising psychiatrist for Mr. Rodriguez's treatment, I want to emphasize that separating him from his service animal would constitute a medical emergency. Bruno isn't just a companion, he's a critical component of Mr. Rodriguez's treatment plan for combat-related PTSD. Removing Bruno would be equivalent to confiscating a veteran's prescription medication or medical equipment. Maria's response was immediate and decisive. Dr. Chun, thank you for that clarification. Officer Walsh, you now have professional medical testimony that what you're proposing would harm a veteran's health. If you proceed with confiscating this legitimately credentialed service animal against medical advice, you will be personally liable for any consequences to Master Sergeant Rodriguez's well-being. The legal implications of Maria's statement hit Patricia like a physical blow. The realization that she could be held personally responsible for causing medical harm to a combat veteran shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Her earlier confidence evaporated as she began to grasp the magnitude of the mistake she had made. But Maria wasn't finished. Her next words demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made her an effective military commander and a successful politician. Officer Walsh, I'm going to give you an opportunity to demonstrate that Phoenix Animal Control can correct its mistakes and treat veterans with the respect they deserve. You're going to apologize to Master Sergeant Rodriguez for questioning his service and his legitimate service animal. You're going to ensure that his documentation is properly entered into your system. And you're going to personally guarantee that no veteran will face this kind of harassment from your department in the future. The silence that the next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would transform Jake's quiet victory into something much larger and more significant. At 7 a.m., while Jake was completing his morning routine of preparing Bruno's breakfast and reviewing his class schedule, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, but a voice that commanded immediate attention. Master Sergeant Rodriguez. This is General Patricia Williams, Arizona National Guard. Governor Vasquez has briefed me on yesterday's incident, and I need to meet with you immediately. There's something happening that you need to know about. General Williams' tone carried the same urgency that Jake remembered from mission briefings in Afghanistan, the kind that meant lives were at stake and time was running out. Within an hour, Jake found himself sitting in the conference room at the Arizona National Guard headquarters, Bruno lying calmly at his feet while General Williams spread documents across the polished table. Jake, what happened to you yesterday wasn't an isolated incident, General Williams began, her expression grim. Governor Vasquez ordered a statewide investigation into veteran services complaints, and what we've discovered is staggering. In the past 6 months alone, we've documented over 200 cases of veterans being harassed, denied services, or treated with disrespect by various government agencies across Arizona. The scope of the problem hit Jake like a physical blow. He had assumed his experience with Patricia Walsh was unusual, an unfortunate encounter with one poorly trained bureaucrat. The reality was far worse: systemic discrimination against veterans. That extended across multiple agencies and jurisdictions throughout the state. General Williams continued laying out the evidence. We have veterans denied housing assistance because caseworkers didn't believe their service records. We have disabled veterans refused accommodations because employees claimed their injuries weren't visible enough to be real. We have service members transitioning to civilian life being told their military training doesn't qualify them for jobs they could do with their eyes closed. Each revelation added another layer to Jake's understanding of the problem he had inadvertently exposed. His phone call to Governor Vasquez hadn't just solved his immediate crisis. It had pulled back the curtain on a pattern of institutional failures that were affecting thousands of veterans across Arizona. But here's what's really disturbing, General Williams said, pulling out a thick folder filled with complaint forms and incident reports. Most of these veterans never filed official complaints. They just accepted the treatment, internalized the disrespect, and walked away. They didn't know they had rights. They didn't know they could fight back. They didn't know anyone would listen. The psychological impact of this revelation was profound for Jake. His own struggles with self-advocacy, his tendency to accept unfair treatment rather than create conflict, his assumption that civilian authorities always had the right to question his credentials. These weren't personal weaknesses. They were symptoms of a broader cultural problem that treated veteran status as something to be proven rather than honored. Dr. Chun, who had been invited to the meeting to provide clinical perspective, added her professional observations. What we're seeing is institutional gaslighting on a massive scale. Veterans are being told their experiences aren't valid. Their documentation isn't sufficient. Their service doesn't matter. For individuals already struggling with PTSD, depression, and adjustment disorders, this kind of systematic dismissal can be devastating. General Williams nodded grimly. Which brings me to why I called you here, Jake. Governor Vasquez has decided to take unprecedented action. She's declaring a state of emergency regarding veteran services in Arizona. She's mobilizing the National Guard to conduct a comprehensive audit of every government agency that interacts with veterans. And she wants you to lead the Civilian Oversight Committee. The magnitude of what General Williams was proposing took Jake's breath away. A state of emergency declaration would give Governor Vasquez extraordinary powers to bypass normal bureaucratic procedures, redirect resources, and implement immediate reforms. The National Guard mobilization would provide the personnel and authority needed to investigate agencies that had previously operated without meaningful oversight. General, I'm honored by the governor's confidence, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to lead something this important. Jake responded, his natural humility wrestling with the recognition that this was exactly the kind of mission he had been preparing for without realizing it. Jake, you're more qualified than anyone else we could choose, General Williams replied firmly. You have combat leadership experience. You understand the veteran community's needs. You've navigated the system yourself. And most importantly, you have the moral authority that comes from standing up when it mattered. Yesterday, you didn't. Just fight for yourself. You opened the door for thousands of other veterans to find their voices. The weight of responsibility was immense, but Jake felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced since his military retirement. A sense of mission, of purpose, of the opportunity to serve something larger than himself. Bruno seemed to sense his handler's emotional shift, raising his head to make eye contact and provide the grounding pressure that always helped Jake make difficult decisions. Over the next several hours, General Williams outlined the scope of the proposed operation. Teams of National Guard investigators would visit every VA office, social services agency, housing authority, and employment center in the state. They would interview staff, review policies, and document instances of veteran mistreatment. The Civilian Oversight Committee would ensure that the investigation remained focused on helping veterans rather than simply punishing bureaucrats. But this isn't just about finding problems, General Williams emphasized. This is about creating solutions. We want to identify the agencies that are doing things right, understand what makes them successful, and replicate those practices statewide. We want to create a model that other states can follow. The positive focus of the mission appealed to Jake's leadership instincts. Military operations were most successful when they had clear objectives beyond simply defeating the enemy. The best missions created lasting improvements that made future conflicts unnecessary. This Veteran Services emergency could become a template for transforming how government agencies throughout the country treated military families. Dr. Chun raised an important point about the psychological impact of the investigation. We need to be careful that this process doesn't re-traumatize veterans who have already been hurt by the system. Many of them will be reluctant to come forward, afraid of retaliation, or simply resigned to accepting poor treatment. We need to create safe spaces for them to share their experiences. Jake's military experience provided valuable perspective on this challenge. In Afghanistan, we learned that effective intelligence gathering required building trust with local populations who had been hurt by previous military operations. We had to prove through actions, not just words, that we were there to help rather than harm. The same principles apply here. General Williams was taking detailed notes as Jake spoke, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. Jake, that's exactly the kind of thinking we need. You understand that this isn't just a bureaucratic exercise, it's a mission to restore faith between veterans and the institutions that are supposed to serve them. The conversation turned to practical logistics. The state of emergency would be declared the following Monday, giving the team time to prepare materials, brief personnel, and establish communication protocols. Jake would need to recruit other veterans to serve on the oversight committee, ensuring representation from different eras of service, different branches of the military, and different demographic groups. I want to include veterans who represent the full spectrum of our community, Jake said, his leadership instincts fully engaged. We need women veterans who've faced gender discrimination, minority veterans who've dealt with racial bias, LGBTQ veterans who've encountered additional barriers, and veterans from rural areas who've been isolated from services. The inclusivity of Jake's vision impressed both General Williams and Dr. Chun, too. Many veteran advocacy efforts focus primarily on the experiences of male combat veterans, inadvertently marginalizing other members of the military community. Jake's committee would ensure that all veteran voices were heard and represented. As the meeting progressed, Jake found himself energized in ways he hadn't experienced since his medical retirement. The combination of meaningful work, clear objectives, and the opportunity to help fellow veterans was awakening the part of his personality that had made him an effective military leader. Bruno seemed to respond to this energy shift, becoming more alert and engaged rather than simply providing comfort. "General, I have one condition for accepting this leadership role," Jake said, his voice carrying the confidence that had once directed combat operations. "I want full transparency throughout the process. Every finding, every recommendation, every success and failure should be made public. Veterans deserve to know what we discover, and bureaucrats need to understand they're being held accountable." General Williams smiled for the first time during the meeting. "Jake, Governor Vasquez predicted you would say exactly that. She's already arranged for daily press briefings and a public dashboard that will track our progress in real time. This won't be another government investigation that disappears into committee reports that nobody reads." The media strategy was crucial for several reasons. Public attention would pressure agencies to cooperate fully with the investigation rather than simply waiting for it to end. Veterans throughout Arizona would learn about their rights and available resources. Other states would have access to the findings and could implement similar reforms without conducting their own lengthy investigations. Dr. Chun raised another important consideration. We should also think about the long-term psychological impact on the veterans who participate in this process. For many of them, this will be the first time anyone in authority has taken their concerns seriously. That validation can be incredibly healing, but we need to make sure we follow through on our promises. Jake nodded thoughtfully. That's why. The transparency is so important. Veterans have been told that help is coming too many times, only to see nothing change. If we're going to ask them to trust us with their stories, we have to prove that sharing those stories will lead to real improvements. The conversation turned to recruitment strategies for the Oversight Committee. Jake suggested reaching out through existing veteran organizations, social media networks, and the therapy groups that met at community centers across the state. The goal was to build a committee that veterans would recognize as legitimate representatives of their community rather than political appointees with no real understanding of military culture. I want to include veterans who are currently struggling with the system, not just those who've successfully navigated it, Jake explained. The homeless veteran who can't access services because he doesn't have a permanent address. The female veteran whose PTSD claims have been repeatedly denied. The rural veteran who has to drive 3 hours to reach the nearest VA facility. These are the voices that need to be heard. General Williams was clearly impressed by the depth of Jake's thinking about the mission. Jake, I can see why Governor Vasquez wanted you to lead this effort. You're approaching it like a military operation, with clear objectives, comprehensive planning, and genuine concern for the people you're trying to help. As the formal meeting concluded, Jake felt a familiar sensation that he hadn't experienced since his combat days, the clarity that comes from having a mission that truly matters. Bruno seemed to sense this shift, standing and stretching as if preparing for the important work ahead. The partnership between veteran and service dog that had been tested in the community center parking lot was about to be deployed in service of something much larger. The drive home from National Guard headquarters gave Jake time to process the magnitude of what he had agreed to undertake. The quiet veteran who had simply wanted to close a bank account without harassment was about to become the public face of veteran advocacy throughout Arizona. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to create lasting change. That evening, Jake began making the phone calls that would transform his personal victory into a movement for systemic reform. His first call was to Robert Kim, the Navy veteran from his therapy group who had lost his leg in Iraq. Robert's experience with disability accommodations and his natural communication skills would make him an invaluable member of the Oversight Committee. Jake, are you serious? Robert asked after hearing the proposal. The governor wants us to investigate government agencies that have been screwing over veterans, and she's giving us the authority to actually do something about it. Dead serious. Robert, this is our chance to make sure no other veteran goes through what I went through yesterday, or what any of us have gone through. But it's going to be hard work, and we're going to face resistance from people who don't want their failures exposed. Robert's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Brother, I've been waiting my entire civilian life for someone to ask me to serve again. Count me in. Jake's second call was to Maria Santos, the Air Force veteran who struggles with military sexual trauma. Had given her unique insights into how the system failed women veterans. Her perspective would be crucial for ensuring that the investigation addressed gender-specific barriers to veteran services. Maria, this is Jake Rodriguez from Dr. Chun's group. I have something I need to discuss with you that could change how veterans are treated throughout Arizona. The conversation that followed demonstrated Maria's immediate understanding of both the opportunity and the challenges ahead. Jake, I've been documenting my own experiences with VA disability claims. For 3 years, I have a notebook full of incidents where I was dismissed, ignored, or treated like I was making up my trauma. If this investigation can prevent other women veterans from going through that, I'm absolutely interested. Jake's third call was to David Thompson, the Marine whose traumatic brain injury made communication difficult, but whose determination to help fellow veterans was unwavering. David's inclusion on the committee would ensure that veterans with cognitive disabilities had representation in the reform process. The conversation with David required patience and repetition, but his enthusiasm was unmistakable. "Jake, this is big, really big. I want to help, need to help. Other veterans like me get ignored all the time." Each phone call reinforced Jake's conviction that the Oversight Committee could become a powerful force for positive change. These were veterans who had been hurt by the system but hadn't been broken by it. They had maintained their desire to serve, their commitment to their fellow veterans, and their belief that things could be better. As Jake prepared for bed that night, Bruno settled into his usual position beside the bed, ready to interrupt nightmares or provide comfort if needed. But for the first time in months, Jake fell asleep without the anxiety that usually accompanied the end of each day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring the opportunity to transform personal pain into collective healing. The story of Jake Rodriguez was entering a new chapter, one where his individual victory over bureaucratic harassment would become a catalyst for systemic reform that could help thousands of veterans throughout Arizona and potentially across the entire country. The phone call to Governor Vasquez had started something that none of them could have anticipated, a complete reimagining of how government agencies interact with the men and women who have served their country. The quiet hero was about to become a very public leader, and his faithful service dog Bruno would be by his side every step of the way as they embarked on the most important mission of their civilian lives together. Monday morning arrived with the weight of history in the making. At exactly 9 a.m., Governor Maria Vasquez stood behind the podium in the state capitol building, flanked by American and Arizona flags, as she declared the first ever state of emergency for veteran services in United States history. The packed press conference room buzzed with anticipation as reporters, veterans, and government officials gathered to witness what many would later call the most significant veteran advocacy action ever taken by a state government. "My fellow Arizonans," Governor Vasquez began, her voice carrying the authority of command and the passion of personal conviction. "We have failed our veterans. Not occasionally, not accidentally, but systematically and repeatedly. Today, that ends." Jake Rodriguez sat in the front row, Bruno lying calmly at his feet, watching the woman who had once been his commanding officer transform a personal phone call into a statewide revolution. The formal declaration of emergency would grant unprecedented powers to investigate, reform, and rebuild the entire infrastructure of veteran services across Arizona. Over the weekend, our preliminary investigation has revealed over 400 documented cases of veteran mistreatment by government agencies. In the past year alone, Governor Vasquez continued, her voice rising with controlled anger. Veterans denied housing assistance. Disabled service members refused accommodations. Military families treated with suspicion and contempt by the very institutions they served to protect. The statistics hit the room like physical blows. 400 cases represented only the documented incidents, the veterans brave enough to file complaints, persistent enough to keep records, and fortunate enough to have their concerns taken seriously. The true scope of the problem was certainly much larger, hidden in the silence of veterans who had given up hope of being heard. But today, we begin the largest veteran advocacy operation in American history, Governor Vasquez declared, her tone shifting from anger to determination. Operation Honor Guard will mobilize every resource at our disposal to ensure that Arizona becomes the gold standard for veteran services. We will investigate every agency, reform every policy, and rebuild every system that has failed our military families. The name Operation Honor Guard was Jake's suggestion, chosen to reflect both the military precision of the investigation and the protective mission of ensuring that veterans received the respect and services they had earned. Like an honor guard that protects fallen heroes, this operation would protect living veterans from bureaucratic failures and institutional indifference. Governor Vasquez introduced Jake as the civilian director of Operation Honor Guard, describing his military service, his recent experience with bureaucratic harassment, and his vision for comprehensive reform. As Jake approached the podium, Bruno at his side, the room fell silent with recognition that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Combat veteran taking command of a mission to protect his fellow warriors. 3 days ago, I was humiliated in a parking lot by a government employee who questioned my service, dismissed my sacrifice, and threatened to take away the service dog that keeps me functional in civilian society. Jake began, his voice steady, despite the emotional weight of his words. Today, I stand before you as living proof that one veteran's voice, supported by leaders who understand the meaning of loyalty, can become a catalyst for transforming how we treat all veterans. Jake's opening remarks immediately established the personal stakes of Operation Honor Guard while demonstrating that individual courage could create systemic change. His story provided concrete evidence that veteran mistreatment was real, widespread, and unacceptable, while his presence at the podium proved that victims could become leaders in the fight for reform. Operation Honor Guard isn't about punishing government employees or embarrassing agencies. Jake continued, his military leadership experience evident in his clear communication and strategic thinking. This is about creating a culture of honor, respect, and service within our government institutions. We want to identify what works, replicate what succeeds, and eliminate what fails. The positive focus of Jake's message resonated with the audience of reporters, veterans, and government officials. Rather than simply exposing problems, Operation Honor Guard would create solutions. Rather than destroying careers, it would provide opportunities for redemption and improvement. Rather than dividing communities, it would unite them around shared values of service and sacrifice. Jake introduced the members of his Civilian Oversight Committee, each representing different aspects of the veteran community. Robert Kim's experience with disability accommodations, Maria Santos's advocacy for women veterans, David Thompson's representation of veterans with traumatic brain injuries, and 6 other carefully selected committee members who together embodied the diversity and resilience of Arizona's veteran population. This committee doesn't just represent veterans, we are veterans, Jake emphasized. We've navigated these systems, experienced these failures, and survived these betrayals. We know what works because we've lived what doesn't work. And we're here to ensure that no other veteran faces the choice between accepting disrespect and fighting alone for dignity. The press conference concluded with Governor Vasquez announcing the deployment of National Guard investigation teams to government facilities across Arizona. The teams would conduct surprise inspections, interview staff and clients, and document both problems and successes. The findings would be published daily on a public website, ensuring complete transparency throughout the process. Within hours of the press conference, Jake's phone began ringing with calls from veterans across Arizona and throughout the country. Word of Operation Honor Guard was spreading through social media, veteran organizations, and news outlets, creating a groundswell of support that exceeded everyone's expectations. The first call came from a veteran in Tucson whose disability benefits had been suspended because a caseworker claimed his PTSD wasn't severe enough to qualify for compensation. The second came from a Marine in Flagstaff whose service dog had been banned from a government building because security guards didn't recognize his credentials. The third came from a Navy veteran in Phoenix whose housing assistance application had been rejected because the caseworker didn't believe women could develop PTSD from military service. Each call reinforced the necessity of Operation Honor Guard while demonstrating the courage of veterans who were finally willing to share their stories. Jake and his committee members took detailed notes, documenting incidents that would guide the investigation teams and ensure that no case of veteran mistreatment went unaddressed. By the end of the first week, The operation had received over 1,500 calls from veterans reporting problems with government services. The volume was overwhelming, but not surprising to Jake, who understood that years of accumulated frustration were finally finding an outlet through Operation Honor Guard. The first major breakthrough came when National Guard investigators arrived unannounced at the Phoenix Animal Control Office, where Patricia Walsh worked. The inspection revealed a pattern of discriminatory enforcement against veterans with service animals, including written policies that contradicted federal 8A requirements and training materials that encouraged skepticism about veteran disability claims. Patricia Walsh herself had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, but her supervisor's cooperation with the National Guard team demonstrated that systemic change was possible when leadership committed to improvement rather than defensiveness. The Phoenix Animal Control Office became the first agency to request technical assistance from Operation Honor Guard to completely overhaul their veteran services policies. The success at Animal Control created momentum that spread to other agencies throughout Arizona. Government supervisors who had initially viewed Operation Honor Guard as a threat began to see it as an opportunity to identify and fix problems before they became public scandals. The collaborative approach that Jake had insisted upon was proving more effective than punitive investigations. The psychological impact on participating veterans was equally significant. Dr. Chun documented dramatic improvements in PTSD symptoms, depression scores, and overall life satisfaction among veterans who had shared their stories with Operation Honor Guard. For many, the simple act of being believed and having their concerns taken seriously was more therapeutic than years of traditional treatment. What we're seeing is institutional validation replacing institutional betrayal, Dr. Chun explained during the committee meeting. Veterans who had internalized the message that their concerns didn't matter are discovering that their experiences are not only valid but are driving policy changes that will help thousands of other veterans. Jake's own healing was evident to everyone who worked with him. The quiet, defensive veteran who had struggled to advocate for himself in a bank parking lot had become a confident leader directing a statewide reform movement. Bruno's role had evolved as well, from providing basic PTSD support to serving as a calming presence during intense meetings and emotional veteran interviews. The national attention that Operation Honor Guard attracted brought both opportunities and challenges. Veterans organizations from other states requested technical assistance to implement similar programs. Congressional representatives introduced legislation to mandate veteran service standards for federal agencies. Media outlets produced documentary features about the transformation of government services in Arizona. But the attention also brought criticism from government employee unions, fiscal conservatives concerned about investigation costs, and political opponents who questioned whether the state of emergency was constitutionally justified. Jake found himself defending Operation Honor Guard in television interviews, congressional hearings, and public debates that tested his communication skills and emotional resilience. The most significant challenge came when a federal audit questioned whether Arizona's use of National Guard personnel for civilian investigations exceeded state authority. The legal challenge threatened to shut down Operation Honor Guard just as it was achieving major breakthroughs in veteran services reform. Jake's response to the federal challenge demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him an effective military leader. Rather than fighting the legal battle defensively, he used the national attention to advocate for federal legislation that would mandate veteran service standards and create mechanisms for rapid reform when agencies failed to meet those standards. The federal government should be leading this effort, not questioning it. Jake testified before a congressional committee investigating veteran services nationwide. Arizona shouldn't be unique in treating veterans with dignity and respect. Every state should have the tools and authority to ensure that government agencies serve those who served our country. Jake's congressional testimony was broadcast live on C-SPAN and shared millions of times on social media, creating national pressure for federal action on veteran services reform. Within weeks, bipartisan legislation was introduced to create a national Operation Honor Guard program that would provide federal resources for state-level veteran advocacy initiatives. The legal challenges also created an unexpected opportunity for Jake to demonstrate the personal transformation that Operation Honor Guard had enabled. During a particularly hostile cross-examination by attorneys representing government employee unions, Jake maintained his composure and dignity, while clearly articulating the moral imperative behind veteran services reform. "Counselor, you're asking me to justify why veterans deserve to be treated with respect by their own government." Jake responded to one particularly aggressive question. That question answers itself. The men and women who wore this country's uniform, who sacrificed their health and safety in service to our democracy, shouldn't have to prove they deserve basic human dignity from government employees whose salaries they helped pay through their service. The exchange went viral on social media, with the hashtag #VeteransDeserveBetter trending nationally for 3 days. The public response demonstrated that Operation Honor Guard had tapped into a widespread desire for government accountability and veteran advocacy that transcended political party lines and regional differences. 6 months after the press conference that launched Operation Honor Guard, the results were undeniable. Every government agency in Arizona had implemented new veteran services standards. Over 3,000 veteran service complaints had been resolved. Hundreds of government employees had received training on veteran issues and disability law. Most importantly, the suicide rate among Arizona veterans had decreased by 18%, suggesting that institutional validation and improved services were having real impacts on veteran mental health. The transformation of Jake Rodriguez from isolated veteran to national advocate was complete, but his mission was far from finished. Operation Honor Guard had proven that systemic change was possible when veterans found their voices, leaders demonstrated courage, and institutions committed to improvement rather than defensiveness. Standing in the same state capitol building where Governor Vasquez had declared the emergency 6 months earlier, Jake addressed a gathering of veteran advocates, government officials, and media representatives who had come to witness the official conclusion of Operation Honor Guard and the transition to permanent veteran services reforms. 6 months ago, I made a phone call from a parking lot because a government employee threatened to take away my service dog. Jake began, Bruno lying calmly at his feet as always. Today, that phone call has become a national movement that has transformed how government agencies treat veterans in all 50 states. The audience of veterans, many of whom had shared their own stories of mistreatment and redemption through Operation Honor Guard, understood that Jake's journey represented more than individual success. It demonstrated that every veteran had the potential to become an advocate. Every story of mistreatment could become a catalyst for reform, and every act of courage could inspire others to find their own voices. The most important lesson of Operation Honor Guard isn't that government agencies can change. Jake concluded, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had discovered his true calling. The most important lesson is that veterans don't have to accept disrespect, dismissal, or discrimination. We have voices, we have rights, and we have each other. When we stand together, when we support each other, when we demand dignity we earn through our service, we become an unstoppable force for positive change. The standing ovation that followed lasted for 5 minutes, but the impact of Jake's words would last for generations. Operation Honor Guard had ended, but the movement it created would continue to grow, spreading to other states, other agencies, and other communities where veterans needed advocates who understood their struggles and champions who would fight for their rights. Bruno, the service dog whose threatened confiscation had triggered a national movement, remained by Jake's side throughout the celebration, providing the steady presence that had made everything else possible. The partnership between veteran and service animal that had been tested in a Phoenix parking lot had become a symbol of resilience, healing, and the power of refusing to accept injustice. As President Williams prepared to sign the legislation, Jake found himself thinking about all the veterans who weren't present at the ceremony but whose lives would be transformed by the reforms being enacted. The homeless veteran in Seattle, who would now have access to rapid advocacy services when denied housing assistance. The female veteran in rural Montana, whose service dog would be protected from discriminatory challenges. The Purple Heart recipient in Florida, who would encounter government employees trained to recognize and honor his sacrifice. The signing itself was brief but historic. With each stroke of the pen, President Williams transformed Jake's individual victory into permanent federal law that would protect veterans for generations to come. The legislation represented more than policy reform. It embodied a fundamental shift in how America understood its obligations to military families and veterans. "This is what democracy looks like when it works properly," President Williams declared as he handed the signing pen to Jake as a keepsake. One citizen refuses to accept injustice. Leaders respond with courage and determination, and institutions change to better serve the people they were created to protect. Following the ceremony, Jake was approached by veterans from across the country who wanted to share their own stories of transformation through the Honor Guard movement. Each conversation reinforced his understanding that the phone call he had made in a Phoenix parking lot had unleashed something much larger than policy reform. It had awakened a sleeping giant of veteran advocacy that would continue growing and evolving for decades to come. A young Marine veteran from North Carolina described how her local Honor Guard program had helped her navigate via disability claims that had been repeatedly denied. An elderly Army veteran from Ohio explained how advocate intervention had finally secured the housing assistance he had been seeking for 3 years. A Navy veteran from California shared how service animal protections had allowed her to complete college without fear of discrimination. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation Jake had that day was with a 10-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez, no relation, despite the shared surname, whose father had been killed in Afghanistan when she was 5 years old. Emma had traveled to Washington with her grandmother specifically to thank Jake for creating programs that helped military families navigate survivor benefits and educational assistance. "Mr. Rodriguez," Emma said with the serious tone that children sometimes adopt when discussing adult matters, "my daddy died protecting our country, but the people who were supposed to help us after he died weren't very nice to Mommy and Grandma. The Honor Guard people helped us, and now Mommy is in college and we have a nice place to live. Thank you for helping families like mine." The conversation with Emma reminded Jake that veteran advocacy extended far beyond individual veterans to encompass the entire military family community. Spouses, children, and parents of service members also navigated government bureaucracies, faced skeptical officials, and deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The Honor Guard movement had evolved to address these broader needs, creating a comprehensive support network for all military families. As the White House ceremony concluded and guests began to depart, Jake found himself alone in the Rose Garden with Bruno, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this historic moment. The quiet veteran who had struggled to close a bank account without harassment had become a national leader whose advocacy had transformed government services for millions of people. But the most remarkable aspect of Jake's transformation wasn't his rise to national prominence. It was his discovery that personal healing and public service were inextricably connected. By fighting for other veterans, he had completed his own recovery from combat trauma. By refusing to accept injustice, he had found his true calling. By standing up for what was right, he had inspired others to find their own voices. Bruno, sensing his handler's emotional state, moved closer and provided the gentle pressure that always helped Jake process intense experiences. The bond between veteran and service dog that had been tested in a Phoenix parking lot had become unbreakable through 2 years of shared advocacy work. They had traveled together to all 50 states, testified together before countless government committees, and inspired together millions of veterans to demand the respect they deserved. Walking through the White House grounds toward their departure, Jake encountered President Williams once more. The president, a Navy veteran himself, clasped Jake's shoulder in the universal gesture of respect between military personnel. "Jake, what you've accomplished represents the best of American democracy," President Williams said. "You took a personal injustice and transformed it into national reform. You refused to be a victim and chose instead to become a leader. Most importantly, you proved that individual courage can create institutional change when it's supported by people who understand the difference between serving and being served." The president's words captured the essence of what Jake had learned through his journey from isolated veteran to national advocate. Democracy worked best when citizens refused to accept injustice, when leaders demonstrated moral courage, and when institutions remained flexible enough to evolve and improve. The Honor Guard movement had demonstrated these principles in action, creating a template for positive change that extended far beyond veteran issues. As Jake and Bruno departed the White House and returned to their hotel, calls and messages were already flooding in from veterans across the country who wanted to express their gratitude for the legislation that had just been signed. Each message reinforced Jake's understanding that his story was really the story of millions of veterans who had found their voices, demanded their rights, and transformed their personal struggles into collective action for positive change. Phone call that had started everything, that desperate reach for help in a Phoenix parking lot had become a national movement that would continue growing and evolving long after Jake's personal involvement. The Honor Guard legacy would inspire future generations of veterans to refuse injustice, demand dignity, and remember that their service had earned them not just benefits, but respect, recognition, and the right to be treated as the heroes they truly were. Standing in his hotel room, looking out at the Washington Monument illuminated against the night sky, Jake understood that his mission was complete, but his work was far from finished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to advocate for veterans, and new chances to prove that individual courage could create lasting change. Bruno would be by his side, as always, ready to face whatever obstacles awaited them in their continued fight for veteran rights and dignity. The story of Jake Rodriguez had become the story of American democracy at its best, responsive, reformative, and relentlessly committed to the principle that those who serve their country deserve nothing less than their country's unwavering service in return. 5 years had passed since the White House ceremony, and Jake Rodriguez stood before an audience of over 50,000 people at the Lincoln Memorial, delivering the keynote address for the first National Veterans Dignity Day, a federal holiday established to commemorate the Honor Guard movement and celebrate the ongoing fight for veteran rights. Bruno, now showing the gray muzzle of an aging service dog, remained steadfast at Jake's side, their partnership having become legendary within the veteran community worldwide. The crowd stretched from the memorial steps across the National Mall, representing the largest gathering of veterans and military families in American history. They had come from every corner of the nation and beyond, active duty service members on leave, retired generals alongside enlisted personnel, Gold Star families carrying photos of fallen heroes, and thousands of civilians whose lives had been touched by military service members. 5 years ago, I stood in a parking lot in Phoenix, humiliated and angry, watching a government employee threaten to take away the one thing that allowed me to function in civilian society, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly across the vast assembly through strategically placed speakers. Today, I stand before you as living proof that when veterans refuse to accept injustice, when we support each other unconditionally, And when we demand the dignity we earn through our service, we become an unstoppable force for transforming not just our own lives, but the soul of our democracy. The thunderous applause that followed lasted nearly 3 minutes, but Jake was no longer the nervous veteran who had once struggled with public speaking. Years of advocacy work, congressional testimony, and international conferences had transformed him into one of the most compelling speakers in America, capable of moving audiences to both tears and action with his authentic combination of humility and moral authority. The establishment of Veterans Dignity Day represented the culmination of a movement that had grown far beyond anything Jake could have imagined when he made that desperate phone call to Governor Vasquez. What had started as a state-level investigation in Arizona had become a global phenomenon, with over 30 countries implementing their own versions of honor guard programs to better serve their military veterans. Bruno's presence on the memorial steps carried special significance. At 9 years old, he was approaching retirement age for service dogs, but his partnership with Jake had become so iconic that the K9 Veterans Foundation had commissioned a bronze statue of the pair to be permanently installed at the Veterans Administration headquarters in Washington. The statue would serve as a reminder that the bond between veterans and their service animals was sacred and inviolable. In the audience, Jake could see faces that told the story of the Honor Guard movement's evolution and impact. Maria Santos had become the first Latina Secretary of Veterans Affairs, appointed by President Williams to oversee the implementation of veteran services reforms nationwide. Her rise from struggling therapy group participant to cabinet level official demonstrated the transformative power of advocacy and the importance of veteran voices in government leadership. Robert Kim sat in the front row, having recently been elected to Congress on a platform of disability rights and veteran advocacy. His prosthetic leg, once a source of self-consciousness, had become a symbol of resilience that resonated with voters who understood that visible disabilities often represented invisible strength. His first legislative act had been introducing the Service Animal Protection Act, which expanded federal protections to cover all forms of medical support animals. David Thompson, despite the communication challenges caused by his traumatic brain injury, had become one of the most effective advocates for veterans with cognitive disabilities. His patient, persistent approach to advocacy had resulted in groundbreaking reforms in how government agencies accommodated veterans with invisible wounds. His presence at the memorial reminded everyone that courage took many forms, including the daily bravery required to overcome neurological challenges. Dr. Sarah Chun had leveraged her clinical experience with Operation Honor Guard to establish the National Institute for Veteran Mental Health, a research and treatment facility that had revolutionized PTSD therapy by incorporating advocacy training as a core component of recovery programs. Her work had proven that healing accelerated dramatically when trauma survivors found meaningful ways to help others facing similar challenges. Even Patricia Walsh was present at the memorial, now serving as the Director of Veteran Services Training for the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her transformation from antagonist to advocate had become a powerful symbol of redemption and the possibility for personal growth, even in the face of past mistakes. Her training programs had educated over 100,000 government employees about veteran issues, ensuring that future generations of bureaucrats would understand their obligations to military families. Governor Maria Vasquez, now Senator Vasquez and widely considered a front-runner for the next presidential election, had flown in from Arizona specifically to introduce Jake's speech. Her political rise had been built on the foundation of veteran advocacy, but she had never forgotten the phone call that started everything, or the friendship that had endured through years of public service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Senator Vasquez announced to the crowd, "5 years ago, I received a call from an old friend who was facing bureaucratic harassment. Today, that friend has become America's voice for veteran dignity, And that call has become a movement that spans the globe. Please welcome the Director of National Veteran Advocacy, Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez. Jake's speech that day would be remembered as one of the most important addresses in the history of veteran advocacy. Rather than simply celebrating past achievements, he used the platform to announce the next phase of the Honor Guard movement, an international initiative to create veteran advocacy programs in allied nations around the world. "Our mission doesn't end at America's borders," Jake declared, his voice rising with passion. "Warriors who have served alongside American forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, and countless other conflicts deserve the same dignity and respect we demand. For our own veterans, the principles of honor guard, transparency, accountability, and unwavering support for those who served are universal values that can transform how every nation treats its military families." The international expansion of Honor Guard represented Jake's vision for creating a global network of veteran advocates who could share resources, strategies, and support across national boundaries. The program had already been successfully implemented in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, with pilot programs beginning in 12 other allied nations. The audience included delegations of international veterans who had traveled to Washington specifically to learn about Honor Guard methodologies. Colonel James Macpherson from the British Army had brought a team of advocates interested in implementing similar programs throughout the Commonwealth nations. Major Marie Dubois from the French Foreign Legion was documenting strategies for protecting veteran rights within European Union bureaucracies. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka from Japan's Self-Defense Forces was studying Honor Guard principles for application to a traditionally hierarchical society. Today, we announce the creation of the International Veterans Dignity Alliance. Jake continued, unveiling an initiative that had been quietly developed over the past year. This alliance will connect veteran advocates across the globe, sharing resources, training, and support to ensure that no warrior faces bureaucratic harassment alone, regardless of which flag they served under. The announcement generated immediate international interest, with veteran organizations from over 40 countries expressing interest in joining the alliance. The global expansion of Honor Guard principles represented a fundamental shift in how the international community understood its obligations to military personnel and veterans. But Jake's most powerful message that day wasn't about policy or programs. It was about the personal transformation that advocacy could create for veterans struggling with purpose and meaning in civilian life. His own journey from isolated, struggling veteran to internationally recognized leader demonstrated that service didn't end with military retirement, but could be redirected toward equally meaningful civilian missions. "Every veteran in this audience has the potential to become an advocate," Jake emphasized, his gaze sweeping across the massive crowd. "Every story of mistreatment can become a catalyst for reform. Every act of courage can inspire others to find their own voices. The question isn't whether you're qualified to fight for veteran rights. The question is whether you're willing to stand up for what's right." The speech included the announcement of a new scholarship program funded by corporate sponsors who had been moved by the Honor Guard story. The Jake Rodriguez Veteran Advocacy Scholarship would provide full funding for veterans pursuing degrees in public administration, social work, law, and other fields relevant to advocacy work. The program would ensure that future generations of veteran advocates had the educational resources necessary to navigate complex bureaucratic systems. Jake also unveiled the National Veteran Mentorship Network, a program that would pair experienced advocates with newly transitioning veterans who were facing challenges with government services. The network would ensure that no veteran faced bureaucratic obstacles alone, creating a support system that extended far beyond formal advocacy programs. "We've learned that the most effective advocacy happens when veterans support other veterans," Jake explained. "When someone who has navigated the system successfully reaches back to help someone just beginning that journey, both people benefit." The mentor reinforces their own knowledge and purpose, while the mentee gains a guide who truly understands their challenges. The mentorship network had already enrolled over 10,000 veteran mentors and was processing applications from veterans seeking support at a rate of over 500 per week. The program represented a sustainable model for veteran advocacy that could continue, growing without requiring increased government funding or bureaucratic expansion. Bruno's role in the speech was both symbolic and practical. As Jake spoke about the importance of service animal protections, Bruno demonstrated the calm professionalism that had made him an effective ambassador for the service dog community. His presence reminded the audience that advocacy extended beyond human relationships to encompass the animal partners who made civilian life possible for many disabled veterans. The speech concluded with Jake's most personal revelation, his decision to step back from day-to-day advocacy work to focus on training the next generation of veteran leaders. After 5 years of intense public service, he had decided that his greatest contribution would be developing other advocates rather than serving as the primary voice for veteran rights. Leadership isn't about staying in the spotlight forever, Jake concluded, his voice carrying the wisdom earned through years of public service. Leadership is about creating systems that function effectively long after the original leaders have moved on. Today, I announce the Jake Rodriguez Institute for Veteran Advocacy, which will train thousands of veterans to become professional advocates within their own communities. The Institute, funded through a combination of federal grants and private donations, would offer intensive training programs for veterans interested in advocacy careers. Students would learn legal frameworks, communication strategies, bureaucratic navigation, and the psychological principles that made advocacy effective. The curriculum would be based on the lessons learned through 5 years of honor guard operations. The announcement generated immediate interest from veterans across the country who had been inspired by Jake's example but lacked the knowledge or resources to begin their own advocacy work. The Institute would democratize advocacy training, ensuring that veteran voices could be heard in every community, regardless of economic circumstances or educational background. As Jake's speech concluded and the massive crowd began to disperse, individual veterans approached the memorial steps to share their own stories of transformation through the Honor Guard movement. Each conversation reinforced Jake's understanding that his journey from isolated veteran to national leader was really the story of American democracy at its best, responsive to citizen concerns, capable of institutional reform, and committed to the principle that government should serve those who serve their country. A young Marine veteran from Texas explained how Honor Guard advocates had helped her secure disability benefits that had been repeatedly denied. An elderly Air Force veteran from Maine described how service animal protections had allowed him to participate in his grandson's graduation ceremony without fear of discrimination. A Navy veteran from Hawaii shared how mentorship from experienced advocates had helped her navigate the transition from military to civilian career. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation Jake had that day was with a group of children from military families who had been brought to the memorial by their parents. These children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, represented the future of military service and civilian advocacy. Their questions were direct and profound, reflecting a generation that had grown up understanding that veterans deserved respect and that citizens had the power to create positive change. "Mr. Rodriguez," asked 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell, whose mother served in the Army National Guard, "how did you know that making one phone call could change everything for so many people?" Jake's response captured the essence of what he had learned through his advocacy journey. "Sarah, I didn't know that phone call would change anything for anyone except me and Bruno. But I learned that when you stand up for what's right, especially when you're scared or angry or feel alone, other people who believe in the same things will stand up with you. And when enough people stand up together, amazing things can happen." The conversation with the children reminded Jake that the Honor Guard legacy extended far beyond immediate policy reforms or institutional changes. The movement had created a cultural shift in how Americans understood civic engagement, individual responsibility, and the power of ordinary citizens to create extraordinary change. As the sun set over the Lincoln Memorial and the last visitors departed, Jake found himself alone with Bruno on the memorial steps, reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them from a Phoenix parking lot to the heart of American democracy. The quiet veteran who had once struggled to advocate for himself had become a voice for millions, but more importantly, he had helped create a movement that would continue long after his own involvement ended. Bruno, sensing his handler's contemplative mood, moved closer and provided the familiar comfort that had sustained Jake through every challenge of the past 5 years. Their partnership, tested in bureaucratic confrontations and strengthened through advocacy victories, represented the unbreakable bond between veterans and the support systems that made civilian life possible. Walking down the memorial steps, as darkness fell over the National Mall, Jake understood that his story was really the story of every veteran who had ever faced injustice, found courage, and chosen to fight for something larger than themselves. The phone call that started everything had become a symphony of voices demanding dignity, respect, and the recognition that those who served their country deserved nothing less than their country's unwavering service in return. The Honor Guard movement would continue evolving, growing and inspiring new generations of advocates, but its core message would remain constant. Every veteran has a voice, every voice matters, and when veterans stand together, they become an unstoppable force for justice, dignity, and positive change that can transform not just government institutions, but the very soul of democracy itself. 10 years had passed since the parking lot confrontation that changed everything, and Jake Rodriguez found himself standing in an unexpected place, the boardroom of Sterling Trust Bank, the same institution where his journey had begun when he was simply trying to close his wife's old account. But today, he wasn't there as a customer or even as an advocate. He was there as the newly appointed chairman of the board, having been recruited by shareholders who recognized that his leadership could transform the bank into a national model for veteran-friendly financial services. Bruno had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, at the remarkable age of 12, surrounded by the love of the man whose life he had helped save and transform. His passing had marked the end of an era, but not the end of Jake's mission. In Bruno's honor, Jake had established the Bruno Foundation, which trained and provided service dogs to veterans free of charge, ensuring that no veteran would ever face the threat of separation from their medical support animal due to financial constraints. The irony of Jake's appointment to Sterling Trust's board wasn't lost on anyone familiar with his story. The bank that had once threatened to charge him a $25 fee despite his veteran status was now seeking his leadership to revolutionize how financial institutions served military families. The transformation represented more than corporate redemption. It symbolized the complete reversal of power dynamics that the Honor Guard movement had achieved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake addressed the board members, his confidence reflecting a decade of leadership experience that had taken him from isolated veteran to internationally recognized advocate. "We have an opportunity to demonstrate that businesses can lead positive change rather than simply respond to public pressure. Sterling Trust can become the first bank in America to achieve full veteran-friendly certification, setting standards that will influence the entire financial services industry." The Veteran-Friendly Certification Program was Jake's latest innovation, developed through the Jake Rodriguez Institute for Veteran Advocacy, in partnership with the Department of Veterans Affairs and major veteran service organizations. Banks, businesses, and government agencies could earn certification by meeting comprehensive standards for veteran services, staff training, and accessibility accommodations. Jake's vision for Sterling Trust went far beyond simple compliance with existing regulations. He proposed creating the first dedicated veteran banking division, with branches staffed entirely by veteran employees who understood the unique financial challenges faced by military families. The division would offer specialized services including deployment savings programs, military education funding, and transition assistance for veterans entering civilian careers. Every teller window, every loan officer desk, every customer service interaction should reflect our understanding that military families have unique needs and deserve specialized support. Jake explained to the board his strategic thinking, shaped by years of studying how institutions could better serve veteran communities. We're not just changing policies, we're changing culture. The Sterling Trust transformation had attracted national attention, with other financial institutions sending delegations to study the bank's veteran services innovations. The Federal Reserve had invited Jake to testify about veteran financial services, and 3 other major banks had already committed to implementing similar programs based on Sterling Trust's model. But Jake's most ambitious project was still in development: the creation of the National Veterans Business Incubator, a program that would provide startup funding, mentorship, and resources for veteran entrepreneurs. The incubator would be housed in a new facility built on the site of the original Sterling Trust branch, where Jake's confrontation with Tiffany had occurred, creating a powerful symbol of transformation from bureaucratic harassment to entrepreneurial empowerment. The business incubator represented Jake's understanding that veteran advocacy needed to evolve beyond addressing problems to creating opportunities. Military veterans possessed leadership skills, discipline, and adaptability that made them natural entrepreneurs, but they often lacked access to the networks and resources necessary for business success. The incubator would address these gaps while creating economic opportunities that benefited entire communities. Among the first cohort of incubator participants was Maria Santos, who had left her position as Secretary of Veterans Affairs to launch a nonprofit organization focused on addressing military sexual trauma. Her organization, Phoenix Rising Veterans, had already expanded to 12 states and was being studied by international organizations seeking to address similar issues in their own military systems. Robert Kim had also become an entrepreneur, founding Adaptive Technology Solutions, a company that developed assistive devices for disabled veterans. His products, ranging from advanced prosthetics to home automation systems, were improving quality of life for thousands of veterans while creating jobs in manufacturing communities across the Midwest. David Thompson, despite his communication challenges, had established a unique consulting firm that helped businesses understand how to accommodate employees with traumatic brain injuries. His patient, methodical approach to explaining cognitive disabilities had made him one of the most sought-after experts in workplace accommodation, proving that perceived limitations could become professional strengths. Dr. Sarah Chun had evolved her practice to focus on what she termed advocacy therapy treatment, approaches that incorporated community service and social justice work as core components of mental health recovery. Her research had demonstrated that veterans who engaged in meaningful advocacy work showed significantly faster improvement in PTSD symptoms, depression, and overall life satisfaction compared to those receiving traditional therapy alone. Even Patricia Walsh had continued her remarkable transformation, having completed law school and now serving as a civil rights attorney specializing in disability discrimination cases. Her legal practice focused specifically on helping veterans who faced bureaucratic harassment, turning her own past mistakes into a powerful tool for protecting others from similar treatment. The 10th anniversary of the original confrontation was being commemorated with the dedication of the Bruno Memorial Garden, a peaceful space adjacent to the Veterans Community Center where Jake's therapy group had met. The garden featured native Arizona plants, quiet walking paths, and a central fountain inscribed with the names of service animals who had died while supporting their veteran handlers. The dedication ceremony drew thousands of visitors, including many of the original participants in Operation Honor Guard, as well as new generations of veteran advocates who had been inspired by the movement's success. The event served as both memorial and celebration, honoring those who had passed while recognizing the continuing growth of veteran advocacy efforts worldwide. Jake's keynote address at the Garden dedication focused on the lessons learned through a decade of advocacy work and the challenges that still lay ahead. His message was both sobering and inspiring, acknowledging that progress remained incomplete while celebrating the extraordinary changes that had already been achieved. 10 years ago, Bruno and I faced a government employee who saw us as problems to be solved rather than people to be served, Jake began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Today, we gather in a memorial garden that exists because millions of people chose to believe that veterans deserve better, that institutions can change, and that individual courage can create collective transformation. The garden's central fountain featured a bronze relief depicting Bruno alongside representations of other service animals, but the inscription captured the broader message of the Honor Guard movement, in memory of all who served with courage, loyalty, and unconditional love. Their service continues in the lives they touched and the changes they inspired. Jake's address included the announcement of his next major initiative, the Global Veterans Dignity University, an institution that would provide advanced education in advocacy, policy development, and organizational leadership specifically for veterans and military family members. The university would offer both degree programs and professional certification courses, creating a pipeline of trained advocates for communities worldwide. Education has always been the foundation of effective advocacy, Jake explained to the audience. We've learned that passionate commitment to veteran rights is essential, but it must be combined with deep knowledge of legal systems, policy development, and organizational change. The university will ensure that future generations of advocates have both the heart and the mind necessary for lasting reform. The university had already secured major funding from corporate sponsors, veteran organizations, and international partners who recognize the need for professional advocacy training. The curriculum would include courses in constitutional law, disability rights, organizational psychology, and international relations, preparing graduates to work in government agencies, nonprofit organizations, or private sector companies serving veteran communities. Jake's personal journey continued to evolve as well. His marriage to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a clinical psychologist who specialized in military family counseling, had brought new dimensions to his understanding of veteran issues. Elena's work with military spouses and children had expanded Jake's perspective beyond individual veteran needs to encompass the broader family systems affected by military service. Their collaborative research on multi-generational military families had revealed that the benefits of effective veteran advocacy extended far beyond individual veterans to positively impact spouses, children, and even grandchildren of service members. The Honor Guard model was now being adapted to address military family needs more comprehensively, recognizing that veteran dignity required family support systems. The couple's joint appearances at advocacy conferences had introduced new audiences to veteran issues while demonstrating that effective advocacy required diverse perspectives and collaborative approaches. Elena's clinical expertise complemented Jake's policy experience, creating presentations that addressed both the emotional and systemic aspects of veteran support. Their work together had also produced groundbreaking research on the intergenerational transmission of military values and the importance of advocacy in maintaining veteran family resilience. Their findings suggested that children of veterans who engaged in advocacy work showed higher levels of civic engagement, leadership development, and community service throughout their lives. The dedication ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new monument, a life-sized bronze statue of Jake and Bruno, captured in the moment of their confrontation with Patricia Walsh, But rather than depicting conflict, the statue showed Jake reaching out his hand in a gesture of reconciliation, while Bruno sat calmly at his side, representing the power of dignity and patience in the face of adversity. The statue's inscription read, "In this place, one veteran's courage became a nation's commitment to honor all who served. May their example inspire future generations to stand up for what is right, support one another in times of challenge, and never forget that individual actions can create lasting change." As visitors filed past the statue throughout the evening, many paused to share their own stories of transformation through the Honor Guard movement. Veterans spoke of bureaucratic victories that had seemed impossible before the movement began. Government employees described how advocacy training had changed their understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Family members explained how veteran advocacy programs had helped them navigate complex systems during their own times of need. But perhaps the most moving testimonials came from the children and young adults who had grown up watching the Honor Guard movement evolve. These young people, now entering college and beginning their own careers, spoke about how Jake's example had shaped their understanding of citizenship, service, and social responsibility. 18-year-old Marcus Thompson, whose grandfather was David Thompson, the Marine veteran with traumatic brain injury, spoke about his decision to study public administration with a focus on veteran services. "Watching my grandfather work with Mr. Rodriguez taught me that everyone has something valuable to contribute, and that real leaders find ways to include everyone in important work." 22-year-old Sarah Kim, Robert Kim's daughter, described how growing up in a veteran advocacy family had influenced her choice to become a civil rights lawyer. "I learned that fighting for what's right isn't just about winning individual cases. It's about changing systems so that other people don't have to fight the same battles." These young voices represented the most enduring legacy of the Honor Guard movement, the inspiration it had provided to a new generation of Americans who understood that democracy required active participation, that injustice demanded response, and that individual courage could indeed create institutional change. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself alone in the memorial garden, surrounded by the quiet beauty of native plants and the gentle sound of flowing water. The space provided a peaceful contrast to the intensity of advocacy work, offering a place for reflection and renewal that honored both past sacrifices and future possibilities. The bronze statue captured not just a moment in Jake's personal journey, but a turning point in American democracy, the transformation of individual grievance into collective action, personal pain into public purpose, and veteran suffering into national healing. The Honor Guard movement had proven that democracy worked best when citizens refused to accept injustice, leaders demonstrated moral courage, and institutions remained flexible enough to evolve and improve. Walking through the garden as twilight settled over Phoenix, Jake understood that his role in the veteran advocacy movement was entering a new phase. The direct confrontations with bureaucratic failures had given way to the longer-term work of building institutions, training leaders, and creating sustainable systems for protecting veteran rights. The movement no longer depended on his individual leadership, but had become a permanent part of American civic life. The memory of Bruno remained vivid as Jake paused beside the memorial fountain, the loyal service dog who had provided stability during Jake's darkest moments had become a symbol of the unbreakable bonds that sustained veterans through every challenge. Their partnership had demonstrated that healing was possible, that service could continue beyond military retirement, and that even the most personal struggles could become catalysts for helping others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to advocate for veteran rights, and new chances to prove that the principles of Honor Guard transparency, accountability, and unwavering support for those who served could continue transforming how America treated its military. Families. The phone call that had started everything had become a permanent part of the national conversation about veteran dignity. government responsibility, and the power of individual courage to create lasting change. Standing beneath the Arizona stars, Jake felt the presence of all the veterans who had contributed to the Honor Guard movement, those who had shared their stories, those who had found their voices, and those who had chosen to transform their personal struggles into powerful advocacy for others. Their collective courage had created something unprecedented in American history, a systematic commitment to ensuring that government served those who had served their country. The story of Jake Rodriguez and the Honor Guard movement would continue inspiring future generations of veterans, advocates, and citizens who understood that democracy required vigilance, that justice demanded action, and that individual courage, when supported by determined leaders and responsive institutions, could indeed move mountains, change hearts, and transform the very essence of how a grateful nation honored its heroes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.